Hello, today is Friday, April 24th, 2015, and I am your host, Sue Brown, and welcome to Info2Rail, your freight train to modern media. How are you all doing today? Well, here in upstate New York, I'd just like to tell you we're having another cold day with snow flurries. This is insane for April. I want to welcome you all to our show, and we have a great one for you today. We're very fortunate to have author and researcher Mark DeWayne Combs with us today. First, I'd like to take a little glimpse into the missing. It's something that I have chosen to do each week with this show, to get the missing out there and see if we can just find them or, alive or not alive and bring them home so that their family has closure and peace. The first one is Alberto Jimmy Felix, age 34, was last seen in Victorville, California on March 15th, 2015. Felix is 5 foot 6 inches tall, 210 pounds, has brown eyes, bald head, and multiple tattoos. Investigators from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department Specialized Investigation Division assumed the investigation due to the suspicious nature of this case. The investigation is ongoing, and anyone with any information regarding the whereabouts of Mr. Felix is urged to contact Detective Ed Delatorre or Sergeant Robert Warwick at 909-387-3589. Callers wishing to remain anonymous are urged to call the We Tip hotline at 1-800-78-CRIME. Or you may leave information on the We Tip website, which is www.wetip.com. And that is case number DR number 171503056. So with anyone on any information on this man, please come forward. The next one is Kane Norman, age 16, was last seen in Columbus, Ohio on December 17th, 2014. He is 5 foot 11 inches tall. He weighs 190 pounds. He has light brown hair and hazel eyes. He was last seen wearing a black hoodie, black jeans, a black hat, and a diamond earring in his left ear. Anyone with any information on his location, please contact the Columbus Police Department at 614-645-4545 or call your local law enforcement agency at 911. It's very important to me, guys, to get these missing people out there, as I tell you every week. So get out there and take a look around and see what see if you can get right on the Info2Rail website, and I post pictures, and all the information is posted there with the phone numbers as well. So get on there and check that out. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, we will have with us Mark DeWayne Combs. Stay tuned. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Okay, we are back with Mark Combs. He's a 53-year-old graduate of Arlington Baptist College in Arlington, Texas. He's self-described critical investigative researcher. He's fascinated by the ancient biblical history and the origin of man. He is a public speaker and event moderator. He's soon to be married to fiancée Kathy in April. If you haven't already gotten married or are married, you're coming up soon. Congratulations. He has a daughter, Daryl, lives and works in Los Angeles, and he is a longtime motivational blogger, just published his first book with 2 more coming in 2015 and 2016. Okay, welcome to Info2Rail, Mark, and thank you so much for being on our show today.
Well, it's good to be with you. I thank you for inviting me as a guest. I'm looking forward to it.
I am as well. Can you start out by telling our listeners a little bit about you and what got you interested in the study and research that you do?
Well, I've got a little bit of a study background, and usually a mystery or something of ancient history always piques my interest. In this case, I also had a little bit of a religious background, and so that's what really piqued my interest about the story of Noah and the flood and really drew me into that. So I wanted to take, a step back, look at all the information that I could uncover as aside from just pulling information from one resource. I wanted to pull information from multiple resources and see what pieces of the puzzle I could put together and kind of get an idea of what seemed to fit and what seemed to, not so easily fall into the mainstream picture.
I know there's been a lot written about Noah's Ark and the flood. What drew you to that specific topic?
And I'm sorry, Sue, ask that question one more time. I lost you just a little bit there.
I'm sorry. There's been a lot written about Noah's flood, and I was wondering what drew you to that specific topic.
Well, there has been a lot written about it by a number of different people. One of the things that really drew me in was things that personally just bothered me about the story. The story itself is something that's kind of has a widespread knowledge around the world in different cultures. Almost every culture has their own version of a flood story. Most people that you come in contact, if you mention Noah and the Ark, they would at least have some recognition as to how much of the story and details they're familiar with. That's going to vary from person to person, but most people would recognize the story in and of itself. For me personally, there were a lot of unanswered questions that really troubled me. There were some things that I just really wanted to dig into, things that I had been taught, from the time I was a child, that, I really wanted to know, the ins and the outs of some of this. And some of the questions that really bothered me, I think more than anything else was, why is it that Noah is chosen and everyone else is apparently judged? Why are the animals judged as well? What did the giraffe, what did the zebra do? Why do they deserve, this? Or what's going on? Why not just punish the wicked? So there was a lot of details that I had been told or in the story as I had heard it growing up that just didn't set very well with me. And I wanted to dig into those things and kind of get an idea of, okay, I've got questions. I'm an adult. I've got research available to me. I can go in search of answers, and that's really the approach that I wanted to take with this.
You wrote an incredible book called End the Beginning. How does your book differ from the traditional viewpoints and popular perspectives of other books?
Well, I think most people, as far as their perspective, they kind of have an agenda that they want to stick to, that they want to kind of perpetrate as far as a particular religious belief that they hold to or adhere to. From my aspect, I want to set all of that aside and take more of an investigative, exploratory approach and just see where the evidence led. For me, there were a lot of questions that I didn't want to answer from a preconceived religious perspective. I didn't think that was a fair approach to take. So I just wanted to dig in and see where the evidence itself would lead and see where the story would go. Basically, in the story, you've got, man is wicked, God gets angry. I'm thinking there has to be more to it than that. Noah builds a boat and he gathers all the animals. To me, that really sounds like a very extensive project. And from the outside looking in, I've got a lot of questions about how is this project even feasible? And then the entire world is flooded by water. If that happened, there has to be some kind of logical explanation as to how it could happen. Where did this water come from? Where did it go? What caused the earth to flood? All of these things were questions that troubled me, and I didn't want to take a particular approach to them other than the evidence that I could dig up and just see where the evidence would lead. Having a particular perspective or an agenda, I wanted to do my best to set that aside. I had questions. I had a lot of them, and I'm just searching through ancient documents for answers. And I don't feel obliged for anyone to go into the research that I've done, to look at the book that I've written and go, okay, Mark has all the answers here. He's provided it for us. It's a nice, neat little wrap up. It's more a book of digging into questions, presenting evidence, presenting information so that people can come to their own conclusions as to, without an agenda being laced over the top of it.
I think one of my favorite things of the Bible is the story of the fallen angels. Can you tell us what role the fallen angels played in the pre-flood world?
Yeah, now this is something that I think in many aspects gets pulled in, and in some aspects it may be slightly misunderstood. It was one of the things that I really wrestled with in the book because so many writings that I came across seem to point to the fallen angels as being the entire reason that the flood happened in the first place. And they tend to get a lot of credit, but I don't know that they're solely responsible for the flood judgment being brought. The first thing I wanted to do was step back and take a look at angels themselves. What are angels? They're definitely not flesh and blood human beings as you and I are. What are angels and how can we identify them? And what I found was there's a variety of different types of angels that are described in ancient documents. Some of the angels that you'll find described are things that we are familiar with. We're kind of familiar with cherubs, and we think of them along the line of a chubby little baby with wings and a bow and arrow that comes out around Valentine's Day. That's not the entire picture of a cherub. A cherub, in my studies and what I was able to find, are more of a warlike creature. They are a type of angel, but they seem to be a guardian to some degree. You'll find in Genesis it speaks of cherubs being placed around the Garden of Eden. You'll find that cherubs are hovering over the Ark of the Covenant. Even King Solomon, when he erected his temple, he put statues of two very large cherubim in the temple proper. They are kind of a warlike or a military-like type of a being. You also have mentioned in some of these ancient documents a type of angel known as a seraphim, and these seem to be dedicated to praise and worship. You hear about seraphim when the angels appeared to the shepherds in the field during the birth of Christ, and it says the skies were filled with the glory of God and everything. These were seraphim. Isaiah wrote about them when he writes in chapter 6 of his prophecy. He says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and praise filled the temple. These were seraphim that he was talking about. So those are two distinctly different types of angelic beings. Another type of angelic being that we're very familiar with is referred to in the scriptures and in other ancient documents as a watcher or a watcher type of a being. And they, I believe, have a completely different role to play. I think they, in every time that I see them mentioned and every time that I see writings about watchers, they are more designed to teach and to help mankind in the realm of guidance and instruction. And so I think that was the specific role they had. But the story that we're familiar with is a story of angels that are fallen and that turn against mankind towards a destructive nature. And these were watcher angels, but only a small percentage of the watchers. The book of Enoch describes about 200 of them, and it actually gives names of some of the leaders, and it describes them as watchers and talks about some of the things that they did. It also talks about these things that they did as being something they did by choice or by design. In other words, they stepped outside of the mission they were given and took upon themselves to do something totally different. And that's where we get the idea of the fallen angels and the interaction between fallen angels and mankind.
In the Bible, it says that it will one day be as it was in the day of Noah. Do you believe that the fallen angels are active again? Do you think that they're back here?
I'm sorry, Sue, ask that for me one more time.
Do you believe that these days are as of the days of Noah? Do you think that the fallen angels are active again? Do you think that they're back here again?
That's a really good question, and I see a lot of discussion on that these days. I think some of that is taken out of the book of Enoch. There's a prophecy that is in chapter 10 of the book of Enoch that talks about these watchers that were judged. And they were judged, they were locked away, and it says they'll be locked away for 70 generations. And a lot of people have looked at that 70 generations prophecy, and they've tried to set down a time period for the passing of 70 generations. How much time would that be? And they've also read into that 70 generations prophecy that at the end of the 70 generations, these fallen angels that were judged would be released again into the world, and they would begin to do the same things that were done in the pre-flood world. The passage in Enoch is in chapter 10 of his book, and the 12th verse of that chapter says, until the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. So there's an indication there that the judgment that they're placed under is a judgment that's forever and ever. I'm not so sure that those particular watchers are released and active in the world again today. I kind of tend towards a belief that they are not. But I do think that their descendants or their offspring, which would be demon seed, are very active in the world today. And we see a lot of things written about demons and demonic beings and creatures in a lot of ancient literature. And I believe that these particular types of beings are disembodied spirits that are direct descendants from these fallen watchers. And I believe that they are active in the world today. And I think we have a lot of illustrations and opportunity to see that.
There's a lot of talk today about the aliens that are showing up in these ships and all this alien stuff going on. There's a lot of talk today that I've heard around different places of these alien things being tied in somehow with the Nephilim or some sort of a tie-in with that kind of stuff. What do you believe about that?
I think that there's definitely a tie-in, but on the basis of anything that we see that's not flesh and blood human is a part of a paranormal or a supernatural dimension of the world that we live in. I think there's too much evidence out there that we can't just look at it and dismiss it all as misinformation or people who were just confused about what they saw or what they experienced. Sue, your listeners know numerous guests that you might have on your show would testify to the fact that there is something very unnatural that is going on in our world today. And the cause of that is something that is not flesh and blood human, but something that is extra-natural or supernatural. The UFO activity, the demonic activity, the spiritual activity, those types of things, I believe, fall into this realm that was crossed over by these fallen angels and by their descendants and offspring. I tend to relate it more to their descendants than to the angels themselves that were pre-flood. But I do think it's tied together, and I do think it has a connection.
Is the world we see today representative of Noah's pre-flood world?
That was one of the questions that I had going into the book. And this was something that really bothered me, not so much from the standpoint of the story of Noah and the flood, as from the standpoint of the story of creation. When we read early in the book of Genesis, we read that, God created the heaven and the earth, and then we read step by step through the first two chapters of Genesis, and it kind of gives us some details there. But all along the way, we're told, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And when you get to the end of creation, to the end of day 6, and God is going to rest on the 7th day, we're told, and it was very good. And then I look at the world we have today, and the world we have today is filled with cracks in the crust that run all over this planet that we know scientifically as fault lines, but even their slightest movement results in tremendous destruction. We have volcanoes all over the planet today that can cause tremendous destruction. Just had one erupt yesterday, I believe it was, down in Chile. We've got leftover remnants of the Ice Age at both of our poles. We've got desert wastelands on every continent around the globe. We've got fiery objects that are falling out of the sky without warning, and you see and you hear about these things all the time. Some of them explode in the sky, and you'll see video of them on YouTube of a meteor that just streaked across the sky and exploded. In many cases, those things are small, and we go out and we're just awed and amazed at the meteor showers and how beautiful it is. But in some cases, these are much larger objects, and in some cases, they do come in contact with our Earth, or they explode over the surface of the Earth. And we've had a number of those. Just a couple of years ago in Chelyabinsk, Russia, they had one that exploded and did quite a bit of damage. I want to say it was in February of 2013. When you step back and you look at this planet, less than 20% of this planet offers a suitable living condition to air-breathing, land-dwelling inhabitants. And it makes me ask the question, how in the world could God say that that's good when 80% of the world is destructive? I personally do not believe that the world that existed in Noah's time prior to the flood and the world that we see today are representative of each other. Are they comparable? A little bit, yes. Same planet. But are they representative? No. The planet we live on today is an absolute train wreck by comparison to what the people of the pre-flood world experienced.
Oh, that makes sense. I myself believe in the Genesis creation. I'm not a big believer in the Big Bang theory. How do they differ?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've got a little bit of a background in science. I'm fascinated by the things that we're able to discover. Our knowledge today and the things that we're able to explore and discover just never ceases to amaze me. The fact that we can take a human being and put them inside of a vessel and shoot them into an orbit around this planet and be able to, observe our planet and the stars and things beyond our planet is just absolutely amazing to me. I never cease to be astounded by the fact that we can do that. And, I remember when I was a child and we were trying to send man to the moon back in the 60s. And that was the big mission, was that we were going to put a man on the surface of the moon. I remember how when there was going to be an Apollo launch at Cape Kennedy, the world almost came to a screeching halt. And we tuned in as the seconds counted down and that rocket got ready to launch. And our astronauts, human beings, were going to leave the surface of this planet and go into space. And we were just all awestruck by the fact that we could do that. We've done that for the last 20 years with our shuttle program, and it's become so commonplace that in many cases it hardly even makes the news that there was a shuttle launch. And we're sending things into space on a daily basis now. And all of these things have given us a deeper look and an understanding at the world in which we live. The Big Bang Theory is something that was first established and proposed a number of years ago, but it's gradually gotten more and more fine-tuned as the years have gone by and as our scientific ability and knowledge has increased. I personally believe in creation. I believe God spoke everything into existence. I don't apologize for that. I don't feel like everybody has to agree with my perspective so that we can have an intelligent conversation, though. They may not agree that way, but I don't agree that way. I'm okay with someone who wants to believe something different because there may be something that I can learn from them. The bottom line is science isn't always wrong. It's not always right, but it's not always wrong. Perhaps our interpretation and our understanding lacks a little insight, but the science in and of itself has increased our knowledge over the years, and it's not specifically an enemy of creation. I do think if you look at the Big Bang and you look at what is described in the Bible as the way God created the heavens and the earth, there's a lot of similarities in the way our universe came into existence. And I spend a little bit of time in the book trying to go into that with a step-by-step walkthrough of creation. It gets a little bit away from the Noah story, but it does give a backdrop to the ancient world that I felt like was necessary. And I think in many cases, we look at a belief in God created the heaven and the earth and a belief in, hey, science says we all came about through a Big Bang, and we think those two ideas are diametrically opposed. And in some aspects they are, but in many aspects they're not. And there's a lot that we can learn from each other in those areas.
I think one of my biggest problems with the Big Bang Theory is, monkey turning to man and such. Because in my belief system, if monkey turned to man and that's how we were created, wouldn't monkey still turn into man today? I mean, it just seems like it wouldn't just stop all of a sudden. You know what I mean?
I do, and I will tell you, when I say, there's some things in the Big Bang Theory that I can look at and appreciate, I will also turn that page and say, when we get to evolution and we want to say, hey, things have evolved from point A to point B, I'd like to dig into that a little bit and more clearly define, what do you mean by things have evolved from point A to point B? I clearly do not see any examples in modern science, in biology, in any science field whatsoever, that we have had one thing that was in existence and has changed from what it was into something that's entirely different. I think one of there's a lot of different examples of evolution, but in many cases, the progress that they're wanting to show is that all things evolve from something that was a common ancestor or a primordial, prehistoric common ancestor. That is diametrically opposed to what the story of creation teaches. The story of creation teaches that when God created the heavens and the earth, and one of the things he created were the things that we see and experience today. And he created everything to exist and to propagate after its own kind, not to change from one kind to another kind to another kind. A pine tree is always going to be a pine tree. An elm tree is always going to be an elm tree. A palm tree is never going to put on roses. Those things are designed to be what they are, and they don't change. Are there various kinds of palm trees? Yes. Are there various kinds of evergreen? Absolutely they are. They do change slightly and adapt to their climate, but if you take a pine tree and you put it up north, it's not all of a sudden going to become a different kind of tree. It's still going to be a pine tree. The same thing happens with animals, mammals, fish, birds, flesh and blood human beings. We change slightly depending on our localized environment, but we stay the same kind. We don't change.
Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying. It seems, to me, it just seems crazy. I mean, a tadpole turns into a frog and such. I can see where things start out one thing and evolve into another. But in my opinion, it always just seems so silly to me. If monkeys were what turned into men, then it seems that they would still be turning into men today.
Well, here's a sampling of that. I mean, a tadpole turns into a frog because that's its life cycle. And that is what most amphibians would experience. They're born in the water, they mature to a certain stage, and they emerge out of the water and begin to live the rest of their life. We're born as very small human beings. We grow into much larger human beings, learn to walk, learn to talk, and that's just a part of maturing from a juvenile to an adult. But one of the things that we look at when we look at a case of evolution is, did something change from what it once was into something that is entirely different? And the process that wants to be set out for this is the necessity for the change to happen, because a particular species of animal or being, whatever it might be, needed to evolve to become to something different. Well, if that were the case, then what had existed in the past, you would think, would have faded from view. And that's just not what we see in the whole process. That's kind of the point you're asking with man evolving from ape, why do we still have apes? We have a variety of apes because apes do change somewhat as their family tree grows, but they don't ever change from an ape into something different. They don't ever change from an ape into a monkey. Monkeys and apes are entirely different. They're on a different set of plane. And whereas we have a variety of each, we don't have anything that crosses over into something different.
Another thing I always wondered about, in the Bible, when when the whole Cain and Abel thing happened, and if God created the earth and Adam was the first human being that he created, when he cast him out and he said, what if the other people don't accept me? Where did the other people come from that were in the other lands if Adam was the first human being?
That's a really good question. There's an entire, I would call it a theology or a doctrine based on an eighth-day creation. The thought being that Adam was created on the eighth day. After generations and generations of men had existed, then Adam and Eve were created, and the story takes off from there. I don't see that is what is portrayed in the Old Testament scriptures, and I don't see that that's what's portrayed in a lot of the ancient documents that I use to put together some of the information for the book that I wrote. In the Old Testament scriptures, and I'm going to back up for just a minute, if I can, and say that when I looked at the different documents that I was going to look at, I set some in a order of priority. One of the first things that I wanted to do was take a document or a resource and determine how valid that resource was. Some of the ones that I used and quote often in the book would include the Old Testament scriptures themselves. I tended to quote from the King James Version of the Bible. I also used the Book of Enoch. There's a number of different varieties, or I shouldn't say varieties, but there are a number of different reproductions of the Book of Enoch. And I did put in a bibliography so people could see which version of the Book of Enoch I was using. I also pulled information from the Book of Jasher. I was a little bit hesitant to do that. I spent some time talking with a number of people who studied ancient documents before I really got to where I trusted much information in the Book of Jasher as a viable source. But I did use a particular version of the Book of Jasher, and I also listed it in the bibliography so people could see which version I used. Another book that I used was an ancient Hebrew text called the Book of Jubilees, and I did the same thing with that, trying to sort out how much I could trust that document, how much that I wanted to use it as a resource. And with the Book of Jubilees, I also listed in my biography in the book as which version I used and why I chose that particular version. Now, getting back to our story of Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, where did all these people come from? In the initial 6 chapters of Genesis, we are taken from a point in time in which the world itself did not exist, all the way to a point in time in which the flood transpires. This period of history covers a little over 1,600 years, and it covers it in 6 chapters. It covers it in just a handful of pages that the average person could read in less than 45 minutes. Not all of the details are given. It's a narrative. It's not trying to lay the groundwork for everything or explain where everything came from. It's a narrative to just say, we're moving from point A to point B. This is what happened. As you study Adam and his family, and I tried to break that down a little bit in the book, using some of these other resources, the book of Jasher, the book of Jubilees, the book of Enoch. As you study them, you'll see that Adam had many children, both sons and daughters. The same thing of all of his offspring. They had many children, both sons and daughters. I personally believe that Adam himself was at the start of creation, that there wasn't a race before him, but that it was just Adam. Where did Cain get his wife from? The book of Jubilees states that it was his sister. The book of Jasher concurs that it was his sister. And so while I use those books to kind of give a little bit of fabric to the text, I go back to the Old Testament text in the book of Genesis and show that Adam and Eve gave birth to Cain. Cain did have a wife. We're not told who that wife was, but everything leads back to Adam and Eve as being the first two and all descendants coming from them. I didn't find anything in the Old Testament text or in the ancient documents that I looked at that indicated otherwise.
I guess my belief in why Noah was chosen to build the ark and preserve life, in my opinion, from what I read and what my belief is that it's because he was of pure blood. He wasn't mixed. What do you find? Why do you think Noah was chosen?
Well, and that I think is, that's one of the questions that I struggled with and wrestled with, and that's one of the reasons that I started my research in the first place. It was among the 5 or 6 questions, that the entire world is destroyed with the exception of Noah and his family. Why Noah? The first thing that we read about Noah in the book of Genesis is that he's 500 years old and begins to have children. That's kind of an odd place to start the biography of someone who is, so preeminently important. Surely he didn't just sit on a mountainside for 500 years and watch goats run by. I mean, there's got to be more to Noah than just he's 500 years old, has 3 sons, now he builds an ark, and God seems to favor him over everybody else, so he's going to survive and everybody else is going to die. But that's kind of where I was at going into the story. Why is Noah so special? I think I would agree with one of your premises that he is of a very special bloodline. This bloodline traces back to Adam and is traced very specifically in the early portion of the book of Genesis with the father and the birth of the son, and then the birth of his son, and then the birth of his son, traced 10 generations from Adam to Noah. Along that way, we find 3 very interesting insights that's kind of mentioned in passing and often overlooked. We get very familiar with the verses that we're reading, and sometimes we read over things that they actually intend to tell us, but we overlook those things. One of the things that we read about Adam when he was in the Garden of Eden was that he walked with God, or that God came and walked with him in the cool of the day. And so there's this personal interaction between Adam and God, which seems to continue until the fall of man. After that, Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, and you don't read anything else about that personal interaction between God and Adam. You get to Enoch, who is mentioned a little bit later on, and you read a phrase about Enoch, that Enoch walked with God. That seems to set him apart from all the other people that we had read about in the genealogy up to that point. Enoch evidently is very special in his relationship with the Creator. You don't read anything about his sons having that same type of relationship until you get to Noah, and you read that same phrase about Noah, that Noah walked with God. And it says that he was perfect in his generations. I think that means two things. One, I think it has to do with the bloodline. His bloodline was not defiled. And one of the things going on during this time was the fallen angels and the seed of the Nephilim and the struggle with between the Nephilim and mankind for control of the earth. But when you get to Noah, Noah's bloodline is pure. The other thing that you see is that it says he was upright and he walked with God. And I think that means that he had a special relationship with the Creator that few other people actually shared or enjoyed. Not so much that God had turned his back on them, but more so that Noah's focus was on the Creator himself as opposed to everything else that was going on. So I think those things tend to separate Noah from the crowd, so to speak.
They don't talk too much in the Bible about Noah's wife and his sons. Why do you think that is?
They really don't. They don't give you a whole lot of information at all. I think it's very evident if this bloodline that we have mentioned is so special, it's very evident that the wife of the people involved in this bloodline, and especially Noah's wife, would be of critical importance, but you don't see them mentioned. All you see is a listing of the sons. You also, when you get to his three sons, they are listed, and you don't see, although all three of them had a wife which went with them on the ark, you don't see a listing as to who these women are, either before the flood or afterwards. You just don't see them listed. And I found that to be an area that raised a lot of question marks for me, because it seems like that would be important details that we should know. One of the things I did discover and find out is that in the book of Genesis, the three sons are listed in the order of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We take that to indicate that Shem was the oldest son, Ham was the middle son, and Japheth was the youngest son. That's actually not the case. And as I dug more into the ancient text, not only the Old Testament itself, but also the book of Enoch, Jubilees, and Jasher, what I found was that the listing of these three sons, they are listed in their order of importance, not in their order of birth. As you get later into the book of Genesis, it identifies Japheth as the oldest son. It identifies Ham as the youngest son, which leaves us with Shem as the son that was born between the two. Shem is listed first because he is the one that the bloodline tracks through after the flood. It follows from him to his descendants on through his sons all the way to the Messiah. And you see that listed in the book of Luke, chapter 3. You also see a partial genealogy in the book of Matthew, chapter 1. Ham is listed because as the second son, because his descendants are the descendants of the Arabic nations. And you find that later in the book of Genesis. Abraham himself fathers two sons. One is through his wife Sarah. The other is through a handmaiden who was from the land of Egypt. The land of Egypt is where Ham's descendants settled. That son through the handmaiden is named Ishmael. Ishmael is blessed of God, and is said that his descendants will become a great nation as well, and they did. That's why Ham is listed second, because his descendants, the descendants through the bloodline of Ishmael, are very important in human history, and so that's why you have him listed second. Japheth is listed third. The one thing that you don't find in any of the Old Testament documents is an indication of where Noah's wife came from, who she was, or where the three sons' wives came from and who they were. That information can be found in the book of Jubilees and also in the book of Jasher. I tried to research it in some other places as well, but the book of Jasher gives us most of that information in chapter 5. It identifies Noah's wife as a woman named Naamah, and lists her as the daughter of Enoch. And then it also lists the three wives of Noah's sons and tells you who their father was. And all of that's in the book of Jasher, chapter 5.
In your book, Methuselah is a very prominent figure. What role did he play in all of this?
Methuselah is a very prominent figure. I think we kind of know him as the person who lived the longest lifespan of anyone, 969 years. Noah's father is a man named Lamech, and he passes away fairly early in life. I say fairly early. He was 777 years of age, according to the book of Genesis. And, none of us will live so long, but for that time period, 777 was fairly early. Most people lived to be about 900 years of age. That was kind of the norm. Adam lived to 930. Seth lived to 912. Seth had a son named Enos. He lived to 905. His son Canaan lived to be 910. Canaan had a son named Mahalaleel, and that's a mouthful to say. But he lived to age 895, so almost 900 years of age. His son Jared lives to 962. And, then you have Jared's son Enoch, and Enoch gives birth to Methuselah. Methuselah is kind of interesting because his name means men of the shooting weapons. It seems quite evident that during the time period when Methuselah is born, that a lot has changed in the world. We find that the Watchers have become very, very active in the world during the days of Canaan and Mahalaleel and the days of Jared. During the days of Jared, it specifically states in the book of Enoch and in the book of Jasher that this is when the Watchers came and began to work and began to instruct men on the face of the earth. But something between the time period of Jared, his son Enoch, and eventually his son Methuselah, something changes. And I believe that's when you have this group of Watchers that kind of become rogues. They kind of go on their own program. They want to produce their own offspring. They want to take over the world and have it and rule it for themselves. I think that happens sometime just before Methuselah is born. Methuselah gives birth to Lamech. Lamech gives birth to Noah. When Noah is born, Lamech is just astounded because Noah is different than any young child he has ever seen. And he goes to his father and asks him, he says, I've begotten a son, and he's unlike any other child I've ever seen. And he says, I want you to go and ask Enoch, is this child my child, or is this a child of the Watchers? It seems that Lamech is actually scared of Noah when Noah is born. And the details of this are all given in the book of Enoch. It's a very interesting story as you read through it. But Enoch tells Methuselah, no, this is the child of prophecy. This is the one that will save the world through the flood. And that's recorded in the last couple of chapters of the book of Enoch, I think chapters 106, 107, right in that area there. Methuselah himself becomes very active in the life of Noah because Noah's father passed away early at age 777. Methuselah kind of becomes the one who takes Noah under his wing, teaches him about the things of the Creator, and I think a lot of those things were things that were passed down to him from Enoch himself, and Methuselah kind of becomes that go-between. He's also the one that works with Noah to get his wife and also to get wives for Noah's three sons. The interesting thing that you see in the life of Methuselah, 7 days prior to the flood, the book of Jasher tells us that 7 days prior to the flood, Methuselah and Noah go to get wives for Noah's 3 sons. This is in Jasher chapter 5. And the 3 sons are married to the daughters, and shortly thereafter, Methuselah dies. Methuselah dies just before Noah and his family get into the ark, just before the flood happens.
Do you, in fact, really believe that people actually lived 900 years? I listened to, like, one day to God, one day to us is as 1,000 days to God. So I wondered if that had something to do with, were they really 900 years old, or was that a different, because they didn't have a clock like we do, or years like we do?
That's a pretty good question. Actually, I do think the time before the flood was a little bit different. I think the time before the flood, the annual cycle of the Earth was different. I think the Earth was at a different axis, and I detail that just a little bit in the book. I did some research on that and actually called on a couple of astronomers for a little bit of help with the calculations of that, but we detailed that a little bit in the book. Did they actually live for 900 years? I've heard a variety of different opinions on that. Some people will state that the statement of their ages seems to indicate how prominent they were or how well respected they were, as opposed to just years. I actually think that they did live for 900 years. I think the lifespan was a lot longer. I do think the world was a lot different, and I think that played a major factor into their particular lifespan as to why it was so long. In the 1st century, you have a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus, and he writes about this particular dilemma. Josephus was a Jewish historian, but he was writing on at the commission of the Roman government. And for the Roman government, they wanted an accurate history of the Jews. And Josephus writes about a lot of these things so that the Romans would have an accurate recording and history of the Jews. Josephus writes about these people living longer lifespans so that they could experience a great year. If you talk to any astronomer, someone, not an astrologer, but an astronomer, someone who studies the stars and the constellations and the revolutions of the sky, and you ask them what is a great year, they will tell you that it is the amount of time that it takes the sky to travel a complete 360 degrees across our perspective point of view here on the Earth. Right now, we travel approximately 1 degree every 72 years. That makes a great year extremely long. I think it's like 28,000 years, something along that line. Every 72 years, we travel 1 degree in that 360 degree spectrum. And this is what I work with astronomers on. If the Earth was not at the 23.5 degree tilt on its axis now, but was in a more upright position, at what point in time would that great year be shorter, and how much shorter would it be? The information that I was given from a couple of astronomers who did the calculations for me, I'm not an astronomer, I went to someone who was. The information that I was given from them was that if the Earth was more upright on its axis to a 0.5 degree tilt as opposed to a 23.5 degree tilt, the time that it takes us to go through 1 degree now, which is 72 years, would then be shortened, and we would go through 30 degrees every 50 years. It would take 600 years to encompass a complete great year. This is the exact period of time that Josephus lists in his books of history, was that a great year at the time of the ancients prior to the flood was equal to 600 years. If you were to take that particular figure or span of time, that 600 years, break it down by the different different constellations that we have, we recognize them today, or popularly know them today as the astrology constellations, the house of Aquarius, Aquarius, Pisces, Libra, Leo, Gemini, etc., Cancer, all the way through. There's 12 different signs, 12 different constellations. Each one of them take up approximately 30 degrees in our sky. And that is astronomy, not astrology. But when you get to the astronomy side of it, they take up 30 degrees in our sky. If you were to put us back on a pace where we go through a great year in 600 years, you would find that we go through each one of those constellations every 50 years. That's exactly how they marked time prior to the flood in Jubilee years. Every 50 years, you move from one era to the next era, and that's exactly how they mark time. I think they did live for extended periods of time. I think it was for a very specific reason, and I think that they were very knowledgeable in terms of astronomy and the constellations and the configurations of the stars as they were in the heavens.
Do you indeed believe that the story of the flood is true?
I believe that it's true. Having done my research and having done my homework, I've come to a conclusion that I do believe it's true. And I believe there's a lot of evidence that would point us in that direction. I know there's a lot of people who don't believe that it's true. I know there's a lot of people who believe that it was a local flood. And certainly we have a lot of evidence of local floods in various parts of the world, all over the world. But I personally do believe that that the story of the flood is true. I believe it's accurate just as it's presented. And I think the more I dug into the evidence, the more that seemed to bear itself out for me, and the more comfortable I became with that belief that the flood itself did happen and that it was a worldwide flood, and that this is a story that can be trusted. We have to remember, as we go back and we look at some of the ancient writings, and that's what a lot of my book was based on, was ancient writings, not modern day writings. I did pull some of the things that we have learned through the fields of science. I did pull a lot of that into the book, but as far as my research was in ancient writings. When I go back into ancient writings, what I find is people write about the flood, the ark, Noah, the patriarchs that lived pre-flood. They write about them as historical figures. They don't write about them as stories, legends, myths. They write about them as historical figures. So I think that if we could somehow step back into a first century setting, I don't think there's any question that the majority prevailing belief would be that this is an actual account and a true story.
Do you believe that there is an end of the world? Do you believe that it's going to happen again? Does Noah foretell of these days?
Yeah, I think he does. And that's a really good question. That's something that I really didn't, that wasn't a part of the premise of this book. It's kind of where the evidence led. It became a part of the book later on, and it's covered in the later chapters of the book, chapters 7, 8, and 9. I get more into the, as the days of Noah were, so shall it be. And those are words that when I use that phrase, I'm quoting Christ directly. He's the one who pointed to Noah and said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be. And the reason that he did that was because he was asked a very pointed question by his disciples, and on a separate occasion by the religious leaders of the day. We spent some time with both of those. One of those is the questions asked by the disciples. His response to those questions are recorded for us in Matthew chapter 24. The questions asked by the religious leaders of the day, his response to those questions are recorded for us in Luke chapter 17 and a little bit more in Luke chapter 21. Two different incidences, but the responses are very similar. the question by the disciples was, what will be the end of the world? When shall these things be? So they were asking about the end of the world. The same type of question is asked by the religious leaders of the day. There was a common concept that we are moving from point A to point B. We are moving through time to a designated, pre-appointed time of the end of the world. Christ didn't shy away from that. And when he was asked that question, he didn't say, what are you guys talking about, the end of the world? This is going to go on forever. He answered that question for them. He said, these are some of the things that you will see. So when someone asks me, hey, do you believe there's going to be an end of the world? I absolutely do. And to answer that question otherwise would be to directly contradict the words of Christ himself. Now, Christ gave us some things that we could kind of point to or look to or recognize as signs that we are approaching that end of the world. One of the things he said or pointed to was, as it was in the days of Noah. And I think that that particular phrase has been interpreted in a wide variety of ways. And quite possibly, it could have a wide variety of meanings. One of those, I apologize, one of those particular interpretations does get into the activity of the fallen angels, watchers, the demonic activity, UFO activity, parapsychologic or paranormal activity, things of that nature. All of those things are kind of pointed to as all of this was going on during the days of Noah. It will be going on during the days of the end. Another thing that is pointed to that was going on during the days of Noah was the fact that there just weren't very many people during Noah's time that actually had a strong personal belief in the Creator. This is something that I was totally unaware of when I went into this initial research. It was something that I had never been taught, I had never read, but something that really kind of bubbled to the surface as I was doing the research. My longtime belief had been that if the flood happened because man was wicked, or possibly the flood happened because the fallen angels were out of control, there were giants in the land, and God had to destroy all them to save the earth. And maybe that's a part of the puzzle, but that's not the entire piece. The one thing that I found as we get into just before the flood is recorded in Jasher chapter 5, where Noah and Methuselah are told to go to the sons of men. Presumably, this would be their relatives, people that they knew. And they were to go to them and ask them to return to worshiping the Creator, to worshiping God, the one who created the universe. They get absolutely no response in a favorable fashion. In fact, it says that in the book of Jasher, it says that the men would not even hear them out, but turned a deaf ear to them and went their way. The common prevailing belief in that day and time, as I've been able to research it and what bubbled to the surface, is that there was no creator, but the creation itself was God. During that particular point in time, everything in creation was worshipped, and that is documented in a wide variety of texts. The Creator himself is deemed to be non-existent. The basis for this philosophy is a teaching called the doctrine of emanations. And the doctrine of emanations basically states that as the Creator created things, he poured himself into that creation. In essence, the more that he created, the more creation there was, but the less Creator there was. And as he continued to create, there was less and less of the Creator and more of the creation, and he poured himself into everything that was creation. The end result of that is a philosophy and a teaching and a doctrine that nature itself is God and nature is deserving of being worshipped. Well, this is the very thing that the Apostle Paul writes about in Romans chapter 1, where he says that when, from the invisible things of him from creation are made known, but they did not worship him as God, but turned themselves in their own imaginations to worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. Paul is referencing the days and the time of Noah. That's exactly what was going on. If you look around us in our day, that's something that is becoming more and more prevalent. Is it a sign that we are cascading and moving closer and closer to the time of the end? I personally believe that it is. How close are we to the time of the end? I'm not real sure about that. But I do think that that is one of the signs that Christ was speaking of that is often overlooked.
Do you believe that, as with God choosing Noah to go on and create a new world, do you think when the world comes to an end again, that God will choose somebody else from our day to start a new world as well?
Well, I think those things are there's a lot of different doctrines and theologies that's spelled out. I have a tendency to take what the Scripture says and use it as my base for, my beliefs, what I want to hang my hat on, so to speak. I think this next destruction of the world that's coming up will usher in the ultimate thing that the disciples were looking for in their day, which was the kingdom of God. They were looking for Jesus to, they accepted him as the Son of God. They were looking for him to set up the kingdom right here on earth today and rule going forward. There is a teaching that, when this comes to an end, when Christ returns, he returns to set up that kingdom that the disciples looked for or looked towards. In the book of Revelation, as you get toward the very last chapters of it, you find the first heaven and the first earth pass away, and there's a new Jerusalem. That new Jerusalem is the new world as it is set up. You read in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter talks about the time before the flood, and then he talks about the end of our age. And one of the things he talks about is in 2 Peter 3, verse 10, he says, "And the elements shall melt." And then he says, "Seeing that all these things shall be dissolved, how shall we live our lives?" So there's an indication that the world we know today, the world that exists, is going to eventually pass away entirely, and a new world will be created. I've got to say that I don't fully understand all of the parameters of that, but I do think that the existence that we know today is going to change drastically when we get to that point. That the coming of the Lord happens and a new world is set up. I don't think that is going to be set up in the same conditions that we have here today.
All right. When you started researching all this and you had all your previously held ideas, what changed during all your research from what you used to believe?
That's a pretty good question. I mean, there was a lot of things that I had to slowly let go of because I did going in. I wanted to try and set my biases aside, but they're there. And they're always there, and they're always in the background. And, it's kind of hard to set those things aside. It's kind of hard to let go of the things that you want to kind of make everything fit that puzzle piece. And that was really pretty difficult for me. Some of the things that changed a little bit for me, I thought I was fairly familiar with the story. I found out that I really wasn't. When I was searching through ancient historical records, I found a lot of details about the story that I didn't know at all. The first thing that changed for me was an understanding that this event has a genuine historical significance in cultures around the world, from both ancient to modern, as opposed to just being primarily a feel-good Bible story. I thought that this was a Sunday school story for kids. It took on a whole different meaning for me. It had a much more historical significance. If I get to the teachings and the words of Christ, and he points to Noah and says, "As it was in that day, so shall it be at the end of the world," all of a sudden this isn't a feel-good Bible story anymore. It's a story of pretty impactful significance. The second thing that really changed for me was a perspective of seeing the story as an event that happened on this planet to the exclusion of all the other planets in our solar system. For the longest time, I thought, well, the flood happened here on Earth. Noah built an ark. They were saved and everything. Some folks see the flood as a local happening. Some folks see it as a global, worldwide happening. I happen to now see the flood as something that transpired in our solar system, and that's not saying that the entire solar system was flooded, but that is saying that there was an agent that caused the destruction of this planet, and it did not cause the destruction of this planet to the exclusion of all the other planets that we share the solar system with. That agent that caused the destruction of this planet also had an effect, a visual effect we can see, that we can study, that we can document on other planets in our solar system. And that was not something that was even on my drawing board in any way, shape, form, or fashion, but it really became a more major portion at the conclusion of Chapter 7 and growing into Chapter 8 as to how did the flood happen, what caused it to happen. And so my perspective on that has changed completely into something that I never would have held to before I started my research. And then I think the last thing probably is I've grown to appreciate documented history much more. We get fascinated and wrapped up with all the things that we can learn in our modern day. And in many cases, I think that kind of overshadows the tremendous wealth of knowledge that we have right at our fingertips through reading history. And not all of that knowledge is supernatural, fantastic, shatter the windows knowledge that we come across. Some days it's just the boring going through the genealogies knowledge that opens tremendous windows of insight for us. One of the things that I found in going through this that completely surprised me was that many of the European nations track their entire history from the time they were formed as a nation into where they are today. Much as we would here in the United States trace our history back to our founding fathers, back to the Pilgrims who came over, our first president. I mean, you ask anybody, well, who was our first president? And most of them could tell you George Washington. I wouldn't say everybody at this stage. I kind of worry about that a little bit. But they could tell you some of our founding fathers. They could possibly name for you George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Ben Franklin. And you say, well, these are the people that we trace our history back to. Well, our history is just a little over 200 years old. But when you go into the European nations, their histories date back a lot further than that. What amazed me was the amount of chronicled history that's available in every single one of those nations as to where they came from, who their ancestry was, and how far back their ancestry can be traced. And in many cases, what I found was many of those chronicles and genealogies and ancestries can be traced all the way back to one of Noah's three sons and Noah himself. And that is something that absolutely astounded me. So when I say I've grown to appreciate documented history more, I really have, in the aspect of there's a lot of things that we have documented, written right before us that we can go to that ought to answer the question that we talked about 15 or 20 minutes ago. Do you believe this is a real story? Well, if it's not a real story, why would so many of the European nations document their founding fathers all the way back to one of the three sons of Noah? It's not vague. It's black and white, and it's available for anyone to research and look up.
That's very true. I've learned a lot with you today. The Bible's always been a very fascinating subject for me. I'm a very big believer in God and Jesus Christ. And, this cleared up a lot of questions that I had. I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing this with us. Can you give everybody your website so that they can go on and check you out?
Sure, and Sue, let me say I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today. I realize that we have covered a lot of questions in a lot of different areas. We've talked about everything from creation to fallen angels to We just wrapped up with recorded history of some of the nations in Europe. So we've spanned a lot of things. The book that I've written is a little over 400 pages long. It covers a lot of these things in greater detail. I've gotten some good feedback from a lot of the readers. They have told me that it's interesting. They've told me that it opens doors to a lot of things that they never knew that were out there. Things that we were just able to highlight today, and there's so many other things that we could spend an entire show just talking about. One of the things I like to remind people, if they pick up my book to read it, they are probably not going to agree with everything that I've written. And it doesn't matter what perspective they have, whether they had a perspective of, hey, I'm from a secular sort, I don't believe anything about the Bible, or whether they had a perspective from, hey, I grew up in the church, I believe everything about the Bible without question. They are probably going to come across one or two or more things in this book that's going to make them scratch their head just a little bit and question what they believe. If they do, then we've accomplished our goal. One of the greatest compliments that I got just last week from someone who has had my book for almost 2 months now and said, I want you to know I'm still reading this book. I'm reading it again. I've really learned a lot from it. I appreciate that so very much. My website is markcombsauthor.com. Mark is spelled with a K. It's M-A-R-K. My last name is spelled C-O-M-B-S. markcombsauthor.com. My book is available through my website. It is also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere that you can buy books over the internet. You can find my book and purchase it. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to join you today. And I also want to remind people, if they go to my website, they have questions they want to directly ask me, there's a link on my website where you can contact me. I don't get thousands of emails every day. So if you send me an email, there's a chance I'm going to respond. All right?
Well, I had the chance to read this book, and it is phenomenal. I love to learn and grow when it comes to anything like that, like God, and I'm open, all the alien stuff, and I've been into the paranormal my whole life. But, this book was very interesting, and, it takes a very creative person and somebody who does their homework to write a book like this, and this was absolutely phenomenal.
Well, thank you, Sue. I appreciate that very much. I am hoping that those who pick it up and spend a little bit of time with it will find things that are of interest and that answer questions, or that maybe inspire them to ask a few questions that they wouldn't have normally asked. We live in a very unique world today, a world that is just overflowing with not only knowledge but resources of where we can get knowledge from. It's a very special time, and I'm thankful to be a part of it.
Do you have any other books coming out or anything you're working on right now?
I do. I've got three things that I'm working on right now, which is probably, my strongest weakness is that I have a tendency to have more than one iron in the fire at a time. So I have to really structure my time to allow me to focus a little bit. I'm working on a follow-up companion book for this one, which basically takes us from the other side of the flood and gets more into how did an 8-person campsite develop into our modern civilization. That's a big question for me. Another question that I have is, hey, if me and you and a handful of other close friends went through the experience that Noah went through with the flood, and we got to the other side and we're out on dry land again and we built a campfire, I think one of the first things that we agree upon as we're sitting around the campfire is we're going to do it right this time. We're not going to mess things up. Well, that's not exactly what happened. I mean, the world turns into a mess real quick. And so those are some of the things that I'm kind of digging into with the companion novel of this one. The other thing that I'm working on is a lot of things in this book that we just kind of scratched the surface on passing through. That book is called My End of the Circle, and we take about a dozen topics and kind of dig into them a little bit deeper. They really would have been a distraction in this book, but they're interesting topics. Things such as did Adam and Eve have children before the fall? What is sin? Who was the serpent? Things of that nature. We wanted to dig into those a little bit. Fun topics to discuss. And I just wanted to dig into those. And then the next thing that's kind of on my drawing board is a book about Adam. The more I read, the more I research, the more I really want to dig into Adam. Who was Adam, and what can we learn from him? So I'm going to be busy over the next few weeks and months and years with a keyboard, I think. If I get that opportunity, hopefully we'll have some more things in print soon.
Well, I'm looking very forward to what you have coming out. And I really hope to have you back on, to talk more about those things as they come up. And I'd like to have you back on to get into a little bit more detail about, the Bible and your book as well. You're very fascinating. And I just really want to thank you for taking your time to come on here with us.
Sue, I'd be honored to join you anytime you feel like that you've got a topic or two you'd like to kick around. I would be honored to join you on your show. I appreciate the opportunity today.
Well, thank you very much, and you have a great day.
Thank you, Sue. Bye-bye.
Bye. That, my friends, was an amazing interview. I'm very interested in the topics of the Bible and such, and to be able to hear somebody else's research and what they're learning and putting together, it fascinates me. I'm open to, plugging things in from a lot of different standpoints and a lot of views, and maybe eventually we'll know the truth, or maybe we'll just have to get, to the end of the world or get to the end of our day to find out that way. Well, that's all we have time for today. We post all our shows on YouTube. If you want to know anything, about our guests, our upcoming shows, just visit our Info2Rail webpage. You just Google Info2Rail, and it'll bring up our Google Sites page, and it'll also bring up our YouTube page. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for being here with us each and every week. And I hope you continue to come back each week, because we have some amazing guests and amazing topics to bring to you. You guys are great, and I want to thank you for all your support and joining us every week. May God bless you and keep you, and may his face shine upon you in these uncertain times. We'll see you soon.